The darkness isn't always out there. Sometimes it's just beneath your skin. Tonight, we're diving into the raw, visceral fear of the truly terrifying. These are not just ghost stories. These are encounters with the malevolent, the unexplainable, and the deeply disturbing. If you're ready to face the absolute unknown, if you dare to listen to the chilling truths that haunt the edges of our reality, then hit that hype button below, please. If it's completely free, if it helps us bring these disturbing realities to light. Tonight, you will hear 7 allegedly true horror stories. 7 separate encounters with the inexplicable. From the chilling secrets of a haunted worship, to the horrifying reality of a sweet old lady, to the silent terror of a creature that hunts the Texas night sky. Each one will dig its claws into a different corner of your mind. So dim the lights, lock the doors, and whatever you do, don't look away. Because once you hear these stories, you'll never look at the world the same way again. My story takes place in Galveston, Texas, a city that has always felt haunted to me, a place that's seen more than its share of death from hurricanes and history. I'm a huge history buff, especially naval history, so when I found out you could actually spend the night on the USS Stewart, a real World War II destroyer escort docked at Seawolf Park, I knew I had to do it. The ship has a reputation for being intensely haunted, and while I was skeptical, I was also incredibly intrigued. I joined a small group for an overnight paranormal investigation. The moment I stepped onto the cold, steel deck, I could feel it, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. The ship is a claustrophobic maze of narrow corridors, steep ladders, and cramped compartments. The air is thick with the smell of old steel, diesel, and the sea. You can feel the history, the energy of the thousands of young men who lived and worked and feared within its metal hull. Our guide told us the stories. The most common reports are of disembodied footsteps, the sound of men running on the deck above, even when the ship is completely empty. They talk about hatches and doors, some of them welded shut for decades, that are heard creaking open and slamming closed in the middle of the night. And they talk about the apparitions, the most famous being a tall, shadowy sailor who is seen walking the forward passageways before vanishing through a solid steel bulkhead. After the tour, we were left to our own devices. I decided to explore the berthing quarters, the cramped rooms where the sailors slept in bunks stacked 3 high. I went alone, wanting a pure experience. I found a compartment deep in the ship, sat on an old ammunition locker in the pitch-black darkness, and just listened. For the first hour, there was nothing but the gentle groaning of the old ship as it shifted in the water. I was starting to feel disappointed, thinking it was all just hype. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from the deck directly above me. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the frantic, heavy-booted sound of someone running back and forth, from one side of the ship to the other. My heart started to pound. I knew for a fact I was the only person in this section of the ship. The rest of my group was on the opposite end, near the mess hall. I radioed them. "Hey, is anyone on the deck above the forward berthing?" The reply came back, crackling with static. "Negative. We're all down here." "Why?" I didn't answer. The running had stopped. It was replaced by a new sound. A slow, heavy, metallic creak. Bang. It was the sound of a heavy steel hatch being opened and then slammed shut. It came from the hallway just outside my compartment. I knew for a fact that the guide had told us all of those hatches were welded shut. I was terrified, but my curiosity was stronger. I switched on my flashlight and slowly, carefully, peered out into the narrow, dark corridor. It was empty. I took a few steps out, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The hallway was lined with the steel doors of the various compartments. And at the far end of the passageway, I saw him. It was just for a second. A tall, dark figure, taller than the doorways, standing there. It was a perfect silhouette of a sailor. I couldn't see a face, just a shape, a void in the darkness. As my light hit him, he didn't run. He just faded. He dissolved into the shadows, right before my eyes. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight beam fixed on the empty spot where he had been. I didn't feel threatened. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of sadness. A feeling of being trapped, of being forever on duty. I realized these weren't malevolent spirits. They were the echoes of the young men who had served on that ship, their energy forever imprinted on its steel soul. I finished the night, but I didn't seek out any more ghosts. I just sat quietly, a respectful guest in their eternal home. Have you ever felt a presence in a historic place? Share your most chilling historical encounter in the comments below. This isn't my story. It's my great-grandmother's story, one she told me when I was a child to scare me into not taking candy from strangers. The thing is, the monster of her story was a real person. Her name was Clara Crane, but the children in the small town of TERIBBLE, Texas, in the early 1900s, had a different name for her, the Candy Lady. According to my great-grandmother, who lived just a few streets away from Clara Crane, the story started with the death of Clara's husband. He died of a sudden, violent illness. The official cause was a heart condition, but the town gossiped. They said Clara had grown tired of him and had poisoned him with a piece of her homemade taffy candy, which she was famous for making. Nothing was ever proven, of course. She was a grieving widow and people eventually moved on. After her husband's death, Clara became a recluse, but she continued her one passion, making candy. She would leave small, beautifully wrapped pieces of taffy on her windowsill for the neighborhood children. In a time of hardship, a free piece of candy was a luxury most kids couldn't resist. They would sneak up to her porch, snatch a piece, and run off, giggling. Then, the children started to disappear. It started with a little boy who lived down the street. He went out to play one afternoon and never came home. A search was organized, but he was never found. A few months later, a little girl vanished from her own front yard. Then another boy. A quiet, creeping terror began to grip the small town of TERIBBLE. Doors were locked early. Children were not allowed to play outside alone. The police had no leads, no suspects, no evidence. But the townspeople, they had their own suspicions. They started to whisper. They noticed that each of the missing children had been one of the kids who loved to take the free candy from Clara Crane's windowsill. The legend of the Candy Lady was born. She was no longer seen as a sweet, eccentric old woman. She became a boogeyman, a real-life witch who lured children to her house with sweets and then made them disappear. My great-grandmother told me she and her friends were terrified of the Candy Lady's house. They would dare each other to run up and touch the fence, but no one ever did. She said you could sometimes see Clara's face in the window, a pale, wrinkled face watching the street. And always on the windowsill was a fresh plate of beautifully wrapped candy, waiting. One of the missing children's older brothers, a teenager, finally decided to take matters into his own hands. He and his friends planned to break into Clara's house one night to find proof of what she'd done. But as they were sneaking through her backyard, they looked into her cellar window and saw something that sent them running in terror. They claimed they saw clumps of human hair and small, bloody tools scattered across a dirt floor. They went to the sheriff, who, spurred by the town's growing fear, finally conducted a search of Clara Crane's property. They found the tools and the hair, and they even found a pit in the cellar with children's teeth in it. But it was all circumstantial. They could never directly tie her to the disappearances. There were no bodies. Clara Crane was questioned, but she was a calm, sweet-faced old woman who denied everything. And in the end, she was never arrested, never charged with any crime. She died of old age years later, leaving behind a house full of secrets and a town forever scarred by her legend. The story of the Candy Lady became a cautionary tale told to generations of Texas children, a terrifying reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a monster. Sometimes it comes in the form of a sweet old lady, offering you a piece of candy. What's the scariest urban legend from your hometown? Let us know the story that kept you up at night. This last story is mine. It happened about 5 years ago, when I was driving home from visiting family in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. If you've never been to South Texas, it's a different world. It's a land of thick brush, lonely roads, and deep-rooted folklore. A place where Mexican legends and Texas reality bleed into one another. As a kid, my abuela, my grandmother, would always warn me about driving on the back roads at night. She would tell me to be careful of La Lechuza. The Lechuza, she said, was a bruja, a witch who could transform herself into a massive, monstrous owl, sometimes with the face of an old woman. She said they hunted the night, whistling like a baby to lure people out of their cars, and that seeing one was a terrible omen. I always thought it was just a spooky story, a way to scare me into being home before dark. I never believed it, until that night. I was driving on a 2-lane highway, miles from the nearest town. It was around midnight. There were no other cars, no lights, just my headlights cutting a tunnel through the pitch-black darkness. I was tired, listening to the radio, and thinking about getting home. That's when I saw it. Something swooped down from the darkness and passed right through my headlights. It was huge. I'm not talking about a hawk or an eagle. This thing was impossibly big, its wingspan nearly as wide as the road itself. I slammed on my brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. It landed on a fence post on the side of the road with a heavy thud. It was an owl, but it was bigger than any owl I had ever seen or read about. It had to be 5 feet tall, with huge, feathery talons gripping the post. As my headlights fully illuminated it, I saw its eyes. They were glowing with a faint, reddish light. I sat there in my car, engine idling, just staring at this impossible creature. I was terrified but also mesmerized. Then, the creature turned its head, slowly, to look directly at me. And the face began to change. The feathers seemed to recede, and the features contorted into those of a wrinkled old woman. Her eyes were still glowing red, and her mouth opened into a hateful sneer. Then she let out a sound. It wasn't an owl's hoot. It was a high-pitched, piercing whistle, a sound that drilled into my ears and made me feel sick. My abuela's words flashed in my mind. She whistles like a baby to lure you out. The lechuza then launched from the fence post, its massive wings beating the air, and flew directly towards my truck. I screamed and stomped on the gas pedal. I swerved as the creature swooped down, its talons scraping across the roof of my truck with a sound like knives on metal. I was now in a frantic chase for my life. I could see the massive, winged shape in my rearview mirror, keeping pace with me, its red eyes like 2 burning coals in the darkness. It would swoop down, its talons screeching across my roof, then pull back up. It was toying with me. I pushed my truck as fast as it would go, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my eyes darting between the dark road ahead and the monster in my mirror. I finally saw the distant, comforting glow of a small town up ahead. As I raced towards the lights, the creature let out one last, furious whistle, and then banked sharply, disappearing back into the suffocating darkness of the South Texas night. I didn't stop driving until I was parked under a streetlight in the middle of that town. I sat there for an hour, shaking. The next morning, I saw the deep, long scratches across the roof of my truck. I believe in my abuela's stories now, and I never, ever drive on the back roads of Texas after dark. What's the scariest legend from your part of the world? Share it in the comments below. This story happened to my friend Alex and his wife Sarah about 10 years ago during a harsh winter storm in a remote part of Michigan. They were driving up to a secluded cabin they owned, hoping for a quiet weekend getaway, but a sudden blizzard hit, making the roads almost impassable. The snow was falling so heavily they could barely see. Their GPS died, and they got hopelessly lost on a winding, unpaved road. The gas tank was nearly empty, and panic was starting to set in. They thought they were going to freeze to death in the middle of nowhere. Just as despair was setting in, through the swirling snow, they saw it. A faint light in the distance. It was a small, rustic cabin, tucked away deep in the woods. Smoke was curling lazily from its chimney, a welcoming sign of warmth and life. Alex and Sarah felt a surge of relief. They pulled up to the cabin, stumbling out of their car into the bitter cold. Alex knocked on the door. It slowly creaked open. Inside, it was warm and cozy, lit by a roaring fireplace. An old man stood in the doorway. He was tall, thin, with a long white beard and kind, crinkled eyes. He smiled. "Well, hello there. Lost, are we?" Alex explained their situation. The old man nodded. Come in, come in. It's a bad night out there. My name's Silas. You're welcome to stay the night. I don't get many visitors." Alex and Sarah were incredibly grateful. Silas offered them hot tea and a place by the fire. He was a quiet, gentle man, but he had a strange intensity in his eyes. He lived alone, seemingly content in his remote cabin. He told them stories of the woods, of the animals, of the silence. They were immensely relieved to be safe and warm. Eventually, Silas showed them to a small spare room with a comfortable bed. "Sleep tight," he said, closing the door. Alex and Sarah quickly fell asleep, exhausted from their ordeal. But a few hours later, Sarah woke up. She had to use the restroom. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Alex, and opened the door. As she stepped into the hallway, she noticed something odd. The door to Silas's room, which she assumed was at the other end of the cabin, was open, and a faint light was coming from inside. She heard a low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump sound. Curiosity got the better of her. She tiptoed down the hallway and peered into Silas's room. It was sparsely furnished, just a bed and a small table. But in the center of the room, Silas was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, facing a small, wooden chest. He was gently, meticulously polishing a human skull. Sarah froze. Her blood ran cold. The thump-thump-thump was the sound of him gently tapping the skull against the floor as he polished it. His face was serene, almost reverent, as he carefully shined the bone. Sarah didn't make a sound. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding. She crept back to her room, slipped back into bed, and lay there wide awake, eyes staring at the ceiling, listening to the gentle thump-thump-thump coming from Silas's room. She woke Alex early, frantic. "We have to go. Now." Alex, confused, asked why. Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell him about the skull. She just insisted. "Something's wrong. We have to leave." They thanked Silas profusely, made hurried excuses about needing to get home, and left the cabin as quickly as possible, even though the storm was still raging. Silas smiled kindly as they left, waving goodbye from his porch. As they drove away, Sarah looked back at the cabin and saw Silas standing in his doorway, holding something in his hand. She couldn't tell what it was from the distance, but the image of that polished skull was burned into her mind. They never told anyone what they saw. They sold the cabin and never went back to that part of the woods. They learned that sometimes, the kindness of strangers in a desolate place can hide a secret far more chilling than any blizzard. What's the most unsettling secret you've ever uncovered in an unexpected place? Share your creepy discovery. This story comes from my friend Sarah, who had just moved into her first apartment in an old building in a quiet, established neighborhood. She was excited, but also a little nervous about living alone. Her apartment was on the second floor, and directly across the street was a beautiful old Victorian house. The house belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Peterson. She was a sweet, frail lady, always impeccably dressed, who would wave to Sarah from her porch every morning. Sarah thought Mrs. Peterson was charming, a classic, friendly neighbor. One night, Sarah was working late at her computer, around 1 a.m. She looked up, stretching, and glanced out her window. The street was dark and quiet, save for a single flickering light in an upstairs window of Mrs. Peterson's house. Sarah thought it was strange. Mrs. Peterson was usually in bed by 9 p.m. As Sarah watched, a silhouette appeared in the flickering window. It was Mrs. Peterson. But she wasn't just standing there. She was slowly, deliberately, raising her arms above her head, as if stretching. Then, she brought them down and began to make slow, repetitive motions. It looked like she was scrubbing the window from the inside. At 1 a.m. in the dark, Sarah frowned. That was bizarre. She watched for a few minutes. Mrs. Peterson continued her slow, mechanical movements. Scrub, scrub, scrub. Her back was to Sarah, so she couldn't see her face. Sarah eventually shrugged it off. Old people have strange habits, she thought. She went back to her computer, but a few minutes later, she glanced out the window again. Mrs. Peterson was still there, still scrubbing, still in the same slow, almost trance-like rhythm. Sarah was starting to get a little unnerved. She got up, walked to her window, and opened it a crack, trying to hear anything. The street was silent. Then, as she watched Mrs. Peterson abruptly stopped scrubbing, she slowly turned her head, and she looked directly at Sarah's window. Sarah froze. Mrs. Peterson's face, illuminated by the flickering light from within her room, was no longer sweet or frail. Her eyes were wide, unnaturally bright, and fixed with an intense, unblinking stare directly at Sarah. A slow, chilling smile spread across her face. A smile that was too wide, too knowing, filled with an unsettling glee. Sarah instinctively ducked back, pulling her curtains shut with a trembling hand. Her heart was pounding. She knew Mrs. Peterson couldn't have seen her from that distance, in the dark. But the way her head had turned, the way her eyes had locked, it felt like she had been watching Sarah. And that smile, it was deeply, profoundly disturbing. Sarah stayed away from her window for the rest of the night. The next morning, she saw Mrs. Peterson on her porch, watering her plants, waving cheerily. Sarah waved back, forcing a smile, but a cold dread lingered in her stomach. She never looked at Mrs. Peterson the same way again. She tried to make excuses for what she saw. Maybe it was a reflection. Maybe she was just sick. But the image of that wide, knowing smile in the flickering darkness, and those unervingly bright eyes, stayed with her. She learned that sometimes, the most innocent-looking neighbors hide secrets that are best left undisturbed. Has a seemingly innocent neighbor ever given you the creeps? Share your unsettling neighbor stories. This story happened to my friend Jake, who moved into an old apartment building in Boston. It was a charming, historic place, but the walls were thin, and you could often hear your neighbors. Jake didn't mind. It was just city life. He mostly kept to himself, working long hours as a graphic designer. One night, around 3 a.m., Jake was woken up by a faint sound. It was coming from the wall next to his bed, the wall he shared with his next-door neighbor. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic scratching. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Jake frowned. He thought it was probably mice. He pounded on the wall. The scratching stopped. He lay down, relieved. But a few minutes later, it started again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. More insistent this time. He pounded on the wall again, harder. Hey, cut it out. Silence. He eventually drifted back to sleep. The next night, the scratching returned. And this time, it was accompanied by a new sound. Faint, low whisper. It sounded like someone was mumbling right against the wall, but he couldn't make out any words. It was just a continuous, unintelligible murmur, punctuated by the scratch, scratch, scratch. Jake was officially unnerved. He knew his neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, lived next door. He had seen her a few times. She seemed quiet and polite. He couldn't imagine her making these noises. He tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept him awake for hours. Over the next few nights, the sounds escalated. The whispering grew louder, sometimes morphing into a guttural chuckle, then back to the frantic scratching. Jake tried putting pillows over his head, blasting music, anything to block it out. Nothing worked. The sounds seemed to seep directly into his mind. He decided he had to confront Mrs. Henderson. The next morning, he knocked on her door. Took a long time for her to answer. She opened the door just a crack. She was a tiny, frail woman, her face pale, her eyes wide and bloodshot, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. "Mrs. Henderson," Jake began, trying to be polite. "I'm so sorry, but I've been hearing some strange noises coming from your apartment at night. Whispering, scratching. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Henderson looked at him, her eyes widening even further. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Oh, you hear them too?" Jake felt a chill. "Hear what?" "The whispers," she said, her voice trembling. "They're in the walls. They've always been there. They scratch. They talk. They say things." She paused, her eyes darting nervously towards the wall they shared. "They want to come out." Jake was speechless. He stared at her. She wasn't just hearing them. She believed they were real. And then he noticed something else. Her fingernails. They were short, jagged, and caked with dried, reddish-brown flakes. As if she had been scratching something for a very long time. He mumbled an apology and quickly retreated to his apartment. He didn't sleep at all that night. He packed his bags in a frantic hurry. The whispers and the scratching seemed louder than ever, more insistent, as if Mrs. Henderson's words had given them strength. He could almost make out words now. His name. His actual name. Jake broke his lease and moved out of that apartment the very next day. He never looked back. He believes that Mrs. Henderson wasn't making the noises. She was enduring them. And whatever was whispering and scratching in those walls, whatever was desperate to get out, it had infected her. And if he had stayed, it would have infected him too. What's the most chilling sound you've ever heard coming from a neighboring apartment or house? Share your unsettling auditory experiences. This final story comes from my friend Chloe, who works a late-night shift in the city. Most nights, she catches the last bus home, which is usually almost empty. It's a long ride, about an hour, and she uses the time to unwind, listening to music and staring out the window. One Tuesday night, she got on the last bus. It was almost 1 a.m. As usual, the bus was practically empty. There was the driver, Chloe, and one other passenger, a man. He was sitting in the very back on the opposite side of the bus from her. He looked unremarkable, dressed in a plain, dark jacket, staring out the window. Chloe barely noticed him. She put on her headphones, settled into her seat, and watched the city lights blur past. The bus rumbled on, making its usual stops. 1 stop, 2 stops, 3 stops. Each time, the bus would stop, the doors would hiss open, wait a moment, then hiss shut, and continue on its route. No one got on. No one got off. Chloe barely paid attention, until she looked up after about 20 minutes. She noticed something odd. The man who had been sitting in the very back seat was no longer there. He was now sitting 2 rows closer to her, still on the opposite side of the bus. Still staring out the window. Chloe frowned. Had she just not noticed him move? She shrugged it off. Maybe he just wanted a different seat. Weird, but whatever. She went back to her music. The bus made another few stops. Still no one on, no one off. Chloe looked up again. The man had moved again. He was now just a few rows behind her. Still on the opposite side. Still silent. Still staring out the window. A cold prickle of unease started in Chloe's stomach. This wasn't normal. He hadn't gotten up. She hadn't heard him move. He was just there. Closer. With every stop. She took off her headphones. The bus was utterly silent, save for the hum of the engine. She could hear her own heart pounding. She glanced at the driver in the rearview mirror. He seemed oblivious, just focused on the road. The bus made another stop. Chloe squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them, half expecting the man to be gone. He wasn't. He was now in the seat directly opposite hers, just a few feet away. His head was still turned towards the window, but Chloe could feel his presence, cold and immense. She felt a wave of pure terror. She couldn't breathe. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She wanted to run, but where? The bus was moving. She was trapped. She stared at the man, his dark jacket, his silent form. She needed to see his face. She needed to know who this was. Slowly, painstakingly, she turned her head, and he turned his head at the exact same moment. His face was pale, almost translucent. His eyes, they were wide open but completely white. No pupils, no irises, just two blank, milky orbs. And the moment their eyes met, a slow, unnatural smile spread across his face. A smile that stretched too wide, revealing teeth that were too long, too sharp. Chloe screamed, a raw, terrified sound. She scrambled out of her seat, tripping over her own feet, and ran to the front of the bus. She pounded on the driver's door. "Stop the bus! Stop the bus! Please, he's in the back." The driver, startled, pulled the bus over to the side of the road. "What's wrong, ma'am? What are you talking about?" Chloe pointed, shaking, at the back of the bus. Him. The man. He kept moving. His face. His eyes. The driver looked into the rearview mirror. Then he looked at Chloe, a confused expression on his face. "Ma'am, there's no one back there. You're the only passenger." Chloe spun around. She looked at the seat where the man had been sitting just seconds ago. It was empty. The entire back of the bus was empty. The man was gone. She didn't believe the driver. She knew what she had seen. She got off the bus right there, in the middle of nowhere, and walked the rest of the way home, crying and looking over her shoulder the entire time. She never took the last bus home again. She says that sometimes on the last ride of the night, you might not be as alone as you think. What's the most unnerving public transport experience you've ever had? Share your story below. Seven stories. 7 chilling glimpses into the true darkness that lurks just beyond the familiar. From the spectral patrols of a forgotten warship, to the secret horrors of a cabin in the snow, to the terrifying reality of a silent passenger on the last bus home. These are the nightmares that remind you that the world is far stranger and far more dangerous than we often dare to imagine. These experiences are etched into the memories of those who lived them, proving that some horrors aren't just fiction. They are real. They are waiting. Which of these stories left you looking over your shoulder? Let me know in the comments below. And if these true tales of terror have left you with a lingering chill, please make sure you've hit that hype button and subscribe to the channel. Because the truth is, the more you look, the more you find. And the more you find, the more you realize you're never truly alone in the dark.